of Forge of Asgard. So Forge of Asgard is a series I'm doing on modding specifically weapons in Quake C, and going over some of the things that I learned in making Arms of Asgard, a mod I've been working on since May of 2020 that is currently in beta. And one of the questions that I've gotten a lot in the forums is, or questions that have led to the reality that a lot of people don't know how to leverage findradius, which is a function in original Quake C. And so I want to show off what you can do with that and highlight some of the sort of pitfalls with using findradius. So, just to recap, my code base is just vanilla Quake, original Quake. I'm using FTE QCZ GUI as my code editor, and then I'm using the FTE, the Forethought engine by Spoik, for all testing and plays. And what we've done so far is we turned the shotgun into a machine gun by editing like 3 number values. Then in the second episode, we turned the super shotgun into a boulder summoning thing that would, if you're aiming at an enemy, it would drop a boulder on their head. And today what we're going to do is we're going to change that boulder targeting from a hit scan to a radius, so more like a spell. So just to recap what we did for the super shotgun last time. When you attack with it, it checks using hit scan straight ahead. Did you hit an enemy? If it doesn't hit anyone, it sends prints a message. And then if it does hit an enemy, it spawns a boulder above the enemy. And then that boulder, upon touch, will just do some heavy damage. So what we really want to do is change the targeting, but not the rest of the code or the logic. So today what we're going to talk about is how does findradius work. We'll touch on a little bit of how Quake C handles looping, especially through entities. It's a bit janky. And then what sort of entity filtering should you use? Because whenever you use findradius for something like a weapon where you're planning to do damage to enemies, findradius will find all kinds of entities that shouldn't take damage and all kinds of things. So, in particular, if you're using a weapon, you want to check and make sure the entity can take damage. I used to have a bug that would trigger inconsistently, or so I thought, where it would just crash everything when I was trying to do some damage. Turns out I was trying to damage torches, which don't have health. So that was a bit of a failure. And the other thing that you want to do is check to make sure that you have line of sight, unless you want an effect to go through walls. Typically, you don't want effects to go through walls unless there's some visual to go along with it, because otherwise it just doesn't make sense to anyone why they died. And it is a really bad user experience there. But findradius does not automatically check line of sight for you. So that's what we're going to be looking at today, and I will now go into our code base here. So this is where I've changed the super shotgun behavior. The original thing it does here is it traces a line ahead of the player, and it really just says, does that thing take damage? If so, spawn a boulder on that entity with the player as the attacker for damage credit. And the reason we coded this up is it's really easy to change the targeting logic without changing anything we've done for the logic of spawning a boulder. All the spawn boulder does is you say who is the victim and who is the attacker, and it handles placing the boulder above the victim and crediting the damage to the attacker. We're gonna basically kill all of this here. And we will start... Actually, you know what? I might use a different weapon so that we can compare the two. But I'll reuse this spawn boulder code. So let's actually go to the rocket launcher. The reason I'm not just going to the nail gun, which is, of course, the next weapon if I were to go linearly after the super shotgun, is the super nail gun has some complications with animations and how they work, and I just don't want to deal with it today. So let's start with the fire rocket. You need an entity to track things for findradius, so we'll just call it nearby entity. for now. So I'm just defining an entity that we'll use, and basically from here we can use find radius. What I'm going to start with is something that just checks for entities a certain radius and prints them so that we know what all is being captured by that find, and then we can filter out things we don't want from there. So first I'll just start that entity equals find radius. One of the things I like about this editor, FTE QCCGUI, is if there's a method or a function, as soon as you start to use it, you'll notice that it has the arguments and the types there. So it needs a vector origin and then a float radius. So the origin, the vector will be self.origin. So that's just the player's origin. And we'll start with a radius of something large. We'll go 400. Now, you'll notice that it's setting an entity to that. We'll have to do some looping through that. So here now we'll set up the loop. And all you do is while nearby entity. What this really means is it's the same as while nearby entity is not equal to world. So the last entity in this loop will always be world, and this determines when we terminate the loop. Put in our bracketry, and then the first thing you want to do here to make sure that it actually is a loop, and most importantly not an infinite loop, is you have to use the dot chain function, which is something that isn't recommended outside of find radius and a few other things in Quake. It's kind of a hacky way of doing something that's like an array of entities, but not quite. So if we just go nearby entity equals nearby entity dot chain, what that will do is technically when we do this find radius thing, what it gets is a list of entities. But at any given time, nearby entity refers to one entity. And so what this does is it iterates through all of the nearby entities found through the find radius function here. So this will say, hey, while this entity is not world, which is always the last item in the list provided by find radius, do this stuff. And then when you're done doing this stuff, this defines skip to the next item on entity on list. Right. So first, just to test and make sure this works, and before we get all kinds of complicated stuff in there, let's just do some printing. We'll go, we want to print the class name so we know what's going on. And then just ending the line so that each item has a different line when it prints out. All right, so let's just go over this one more time. Nearby entity, we want it to be found in a radius of 400 around the player origin, and then iterate through that list until it's exhausted, which is effectively what this means. And for each one, print the entity name and a little bit of a message, then go to the next one, and then once it's gotten through the entire list of entities found with find radius there, then this loop will end and we're done. So this isn't going to do anything but print, but that's all we want because that's what's good for testing. Sweet, compiled on the first try. That makes me feel good because it rarely happens. Very briefly before we get into that, just doing a quick recap. This is the machine gun from the shotgun that we did. We also did make the axe glowing. There was talk of like doing like a lantern weapon. Effect goes on or off. Here's the shotgun. There's no enemies in this map. Let's go to the classic testing map. So this is what the double shotgun did, again, for in case you didn't see it. You aim at someone, drops a rock on their head. But doing hit scan is a bit weird. And so... I can't believe I died in my own demo. Alright. Now we'll see what this is doing. So this is find radius 400. Let's see what it says there. So these are all the entities found within 400 units of the player. So it found a secret, it found shells, it found door, monster army, and it found me, the player. If I go to a different location, it will have more items or more things found. One was blank. That's a bit weird. Oh well. And now you'll notice it is finding 2 doors on this one. So that's good. Test complete. We can get it to detect things. But it's detecting a whole bunch of things that we really don't want to spawn boulders above, like doors. So our logic here is great. We have it printing the name. We'll keep that in for now. We can delete that later, but it's useful for testing. So now what we need to do is target the things we care about. So if the nearby entity health is greater than 0, we don't really want to be dropping boulders on corpses necessarily. I mean, you could. But so we'll skip that. And let's assume we only want to hit things that can take damage. And we also don't want to kill ourselves. So logic will be, if it has health and it can take damage and it isn't me, then we will spawn a boulder. And let's... so entity victim, entity attacker. So the victim is nearby entity, and the attacker is self. Compiles. All right, let's do a quick test here. I just realized that my Quake is playing on my screen that I wasn't sharing, so I wasn't showing you what I was doing there. Let's see if I can get that remedied. Oh, streaming problems. I appreciate everyone's patience with this. I don't really plan to edit these videos down. I might, for this one, make an exception. There we go. Apply settings. Just a moment while I debug some video issues here. Might even be easier just to do this. Change which screen I am streaming. And so I change to the other screen. All right. I'll figure out a better way of doing that soon. Let's go back to our classic testing map. All right, so we now have rockets, and it appears to be dropping rocks on people, even if I can't see them. So the next step will be to check line of sight. There's a couple of ways of doing that. But I want you to see that it drops a whole bunch of boulders on a whole bunch of people if you're in proximity and range of a bunch of people. So that is our Summon Boulders spell. You know what, I'm just gonna do my editing here. To quote Strong Bad about community radio, I can sum it up with three things: dead air, and My apologies, I'm getting used to the streaming thing. All right, so back to the code. The only thing it's not checking for here is line of sight. There are a couple ways to do this. There's the can damage function. Let's just go take a look at that. This is stock Quake. And so there's an entity target, entity inflictor, and it's just sort of going to return, true or false as it's float there. And it does some checks on mins and maxes for some sort of line of sight stuff. And makes sure that it does a bunch of checks. It's interesting. You can just simply leverage that if you want. Oh, here, comments. Returns true if the inflictor can directly damage the target used for explosions and melee attacks. In the past, I've gone and written my own because sometimes this wouldn't trigger for things where it's like, well, I can see the entity, but due to some mins and maxes, it's a little bit weird, and it wasn't triggering. I've written my own for checking line of sight, where you pass in two vectors to see if they have line of sight, or two entities. For simplicity, we're just going to leverage can damage because it's already done for us, and it's most of the way there for what we want. So all we have to do is add this as an additional requirement with and. So can damage. Ooh, my typing skills. And again, entity target, entity inflictor. So the target is nearby enemy entity. Sorry, nearby entity. We'll copy that again. And the attacker is self. And that honestly should be it, assuming I put semicolons at the end of my lines. And what am I doing here? Oh, I need another bracket to close that up. All right. All right, so last time I was able to kill the dude that's just behind that wall by clicking. Oh, looks like I have a bit of a crash there. Can damage. Huh. Breakpoint hit in can damage. Oh, oops. Made a little breakpoint there by accident. I wonder if that's an issue. Oh, I'm sure I want to quit. Huh. Not sure why it's spawning boulders above ammo. That's a bit odd. Well, that's real weird. I'm gonna double check my logic on that. I don't know why it's spawning them for health packs and ammo. This feels like maybe I slapped a less than instead of a greater than. All right, let's go back to our code in the shotgun, or in the rocket launcher. So it's going to loop. It's going to print every entity it finds. And if the entity has health, and it can take damage, and it's not the player, let me just double check my can damage arguments. It is entity target inflictor. Target and inflictor. Oh. That might have been it. That semicolon was unnecessary. Here's another map I love testing on because there's a zombie right there. Love gibbing him. Okay, so there's also Death Knights beyond that wall. And now it's triggering. Get me a couple of slimes. Beauty. Alright, so that is really all I wanted to cover for Find Radius for today. It's really useful for detecting nearby things for, again, targeting enemies for an attack. Arms of Asgard has a number of things that check for specific objects. So, for example, the blood gauntlets create a bunch of blood globules that will fly back to you and heal you when you need it. But it will also do a check. If you have 10 or more of those, it will then turn those into a weapon that you can leverage. I know that Dump Truck recently used it for Progs Dump stuff to make sure that monsters spawning wouldn't give monsters that were already there, so you can check and make sure that there's space. Really useful for anything where you just want to see what's near you. And in particular, one of the things that I'm going to recommend to people is if you're making a melee weapon, the traditional way to do it in Quake is with hit scan. It doesn't feel great when you're going with a swingy kind of weapon. So what I've actually changed most of my melee attacks to do is a small radius ahead of the player, so there's a little bit of tolerance left or right with those attacks, and Find Radius is a beautiful way of achieving that. So let me know if you have any questions, but that is your demo of how to leverage Find Radius within the Quake engine. Thanks a lot, everybody.